It's strange how a single sentence can flip a switch in your head and suddenly make years of "maybe it's just me" snap into focus. For me, it was my dad leaning back in his chair at my sister's rehearsal dinner, smiling like he was being reasonable and saying, "Robert, you're kind of ruining the mood here." Not yelling, not angry, just calm. Final, like a verdict. I'm 31, by the way, old enough to know when I'm being quietly pushed out of my own family. I should probably rewind a bit, because that line didn't come out of nowhere. Families don't usually implode over one dinner unless there's been pressure building for a long time. In ours, the pressure started the day my dad remarried, about 10 years ago, and never really let up. My mom passed when I was in college, and within 2 years my dad met Karen. That's my stepmom. She's the type of person who smiles constantly, uses a soft voice, and somehow makes everything sound like concern even when it's clearly criticism. If you push back, she looks wounded. If you don't, she keeps going. My sister Emily was 16 when Karen came into the picture. I was 21 and already mostly out of the house, working and finishing school. Emily adapted fast. Too fast, honestly. Karen doted on her, called her my girl, bragged about her to anyone who would listen. I became background, not openly disliked, just inconvenient. Like a chair in the room that someone keeps bumping into and sighing at. At first I thought it was temporary. Grief does weird things to families. I told myself Dad was trying to keep the peace. I told myself Karen just needed time. Years passed. Nothing changed. If anything, the gap widened. Emily and Karen became a unit. Dad followed their lead. I learned how to keep my opinions to myself, how to laugh at jokes that landed wrong, how to show up with a gift and leave before things got uncomfortable. By the time Emily got engaged, I was already bracing myself. Weddings have a way of dragging every unspoken family issue into the open and seating them together at round tables. Still, I wanted to be there for my sister. Despite everything, I loved her. Or at least I loved the version of her from before all this. When she asked me to come to the rehearsal dinner, I took it as a good sign. An olive branch. Maybe even an attempt at normalcy. The dinner was at this upscale Italian place downtown. Private room, linen tablecloths, dim lighting. The kind of place where the servers introduce themselves and the menus don't have prices. I showed up early, partly out of nerves, partly because I've learned it's better to arrive before the room fills with energy that you don't quite fit into. I brought a card for Emily and her fiancé, something simple and sincere. I rehearsed what I'd say in my head so I wouldn't come off stiff or distant. Karen noticed me the moment I walked in. She always does. Her smile flickered for just a second before she smoothed it out and came over to hug me. Light and quick, like it was a formality she wanted to get through. "Robert," she said softly, "you made it." Not, "I'm glad you're here." Just acknowledgement. Dad clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good to see you, son." But his eyes were already scanning the room, checking tables, making sure everything was running smoothly. Emily was busy with her friends and bridesmaids, glowing, laughing, fully in her element. I waited for a moment, then caught her attention and gave her a quick hug. She thanked me for coming, distracted but polite. That was it. At first, things were fine. Small talk, drinks, stories about how Emily and her fiancé met, stories I'd heard before but listened to anyway. I tried to stay neutral, agreeable. The less friction, the better. But I could feel it creeping in, that familiar sense of being slightly off script. Like everyone else had rehearsed their lines, and I was improvising. It started with little things. Karen correcting me, gently, when I mentioned an old family vacation. "Oh, it wasn't like that," she said, smiling, even though she hadn't been there. Emily rolling her eyes when I laughed at something Dad said. One of Karen's relatives asking me what I do now, then nodding politely and turning away mid-sentence when someone more interesting walked by. I told myself not to read into it. I focused on my plate. I sipped my drink slowly. I reminded myself this night wasn't about me. But then Emily's fiancé's parents started talking about family traditions, about how important it was to have everyone together, united, supportive. Karen jumped in immediately, talking about how close-knit we all were, how much she valued harmony. She said it while glancing at me, just briefly, like she was checking whether I was going to contradict her. I didn't. I never do. But something in me tightened anyway. At some point, Dad asked me how work was going. A normal question. I answered honestly but briefly. Before I could finish, Karen leaned in and said, in that same gentle tone, "You know, Roberts always had trouble sticking with one thing. She laughed lightly, like it was an affectionate joke. A few people chuckled. I felt heat crawl up my neck. I looked at Dad, waiting. He smiled awkwardly and took a sip of his wine. No correction. No, that's not fair. Just silence. That's when I said, maybe a little too sharply. Actually, I've been at the same company for 4 years now. Not loud. Not rude. Just factual. The table went quiet for half a second too long. Karen tilted her head and said, "See? So defensive. We're just having fun." And then Dad sighed. Not dramatically. Just enough to be noticeable. He leaned back, folded his hands, and said it. "Robert, you're kind of ruining the mood here." It felt like the air left the room. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the lighting suddenly seemed harsher. I opened my mouth, then closed it. I wasn't even sure what I would say. I wasn't angry yet. I was stunned, embarrassed, shrunk down to the size of a problem that needed managing. Karen leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper, meant only for me. "You're embarrassing yourself," she said. "Let's not make this about you." That's when I stood up. I didn't make a speech. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I pushed my chair in quietly, picked up my jacket, and said, "I'm going to head out. Congratulations, Emily." My voice sounded calm, even to me, detached, like it belonged to someone else. For a moment, no one stopped me. Then Emily looked up, confused, and asked, "Wait, what?" Dad started to say my name, but I was already walking toward the door. Karen didn't follow. She just watched me go, her expression unreadable. As I reached the hallway outside the private room, I could still hear laughter starting up again behind me, forced and brittle. I told myself I'd done the mature thing, that leaving quietly was better than staying and letting things escalate. But as I stepped out into the cool night air, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check the phone right away. I stood there on the sidewalk outside the restaurant for a full minute, just breathing, listening to the muffled sound of traffic and the faint hum of conversation leaking out every time the door opened. Part of me hoped the buzz had been nothing important. Another part already knew better. My phone had a way of vibrating only when something was about to get worse. When I finally looked, it was a text from my dad. Just 4 words. "Let's talk tomorrow." That sentence has always meant the same thing in my family. It doesn't mean discussion. It doesn't mean understanding. It means a decision has already been made, and tomorrow is when you're expected to accept it quietly. I typed back, "Sure," because that's what I always do. Then I put my phone away and drove home feeling like I'd just been politely escorted out of something I was never really part of to begin with. The next morning, I woke up with that familiar heaviness in my chest, the kind that makes even small tasks feel unnecessary. I replayed the dinner over and over in my head, analyzing every word I'd said, every expression I'd made, searching for the moment where I'd supposedly crossed some invisible line. I kept coming back to the same conclusion. I hadn't done anything wrong. And somehow, that made it worse. Dad called around noon. Not a video call. Not an invitation to come over. Just a phone call, like he was handling a minor administrative issue. He didn't waste time easing into it. "Last night got awkward," he said. I waited. "Karen feels like you came in with a chip on your shoulder," he continued. "Emily noticed it too. This is a stressful time for her, Robert. We really need everyone to be supportive." Supportive. That word again. I asked him, calmly, what exactly I'd done that was unsupportive. There was a pause. Papers rustling. A sigh. He mentioned my tone. My defensiveness. The way I challenged Karen in front of other people. When I reminded him that she'd taken a shot at my career first, he said, "She didn't mean it that way." I told him how it felt to be whispered to be told I was embarrassing myself. He didn't deny it happened. He just said, "You know how she is." She was trying to keep things calm. Something in me cracked then. Not loudly. Not all at once. Just enough to let the truth seep in. Calm, in this family, had always meant me staying quiet. Before we hung up, he added, almost as an afterthought, "We should probably talk about the wedding logistics soon." I asked what he meant. "Well," he said carefully, "after last night, Karen thinks it might be better if you take a step back. You know, just to avoid any distractions." Distractions. Like I was a flickering light they hadn't managed to fix yet. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I just said I understood and ended the call. I sat there afterward, staring at my blank TV screen, feeling that old mix of anger and sadness swirl together until it was hard to tell them apart. Over the next few weeks, The distance became obvious. Group chats went quiet whenever I replied. Wedding updates came secondhand or not at all. When I asked Emily directly if everything was okay, she said she was just busy and stressed and didn't have time for family drama. That phrase stung more than she probably realized. To her, I wasn't family. I was drama. Then came the invitations. I found out from a cousin that the seating chart had been finalized. Apparently, there had been a long discussion about where to put me. Karen had suggested a table near the back, with people Robert might be more comfortable around. Dad agreed. Emily didn't object. When I heard that, something inside me went cold. I wasn't being excluded outright. I was being managed. A few days later, Dad invited me over. In person this time. I should have known that meant something bigger was coming. Karen was there, of course, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea she didn't drink, hands folded like she was about to deliver bad news in the most reasonable way possible. Dad stood near the counter, arms crossed, avoiding my eyes. Karen started. "We've been thinking a lot about the rehearsal dinner," she said gently. "And about patterns." Patterns. Another favorite word. I asked her to explain. She talked about how I tend to withdraw, how my presence sometimes shifts the energy in a room. She said it wasn't intentional, but intentions didn't matter if the impact was negative. Dad nodded along, like he was listening to a weather report. Then she said it. "Because of that, we think it might be best if you don't attend some of the wedding events." Some, not all. Carefully chosen words. I asked which ones. She glanced at Dad. He cleared his throat. "The morning prep. The family photos. Probably the reception speeches." I laughed. Once, before I could stop myself. It came out sharp and humorless. "So basically, everything where I might be visible." Karen's expression tightened just a bit. "We're not punishing you," she said. "We're protecting Emily." That's when I realized something important. This wasn't about the rehearsal dinner. It wasn't about my tone or my attitude or even Karen's feelings. This was about control. About curating an image of a perfect family and quietly removing any piece that didn't fit the picture. I told them I needed time to think. Dad seemed relieved. Karen smiled like we'd made progress. On my way out, I noticed a stack of folders on the counter. Wedding-related paperwork, guest lists, vendor contracts. One folder, slightly open, had my name on a sticky note. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The message was already clear. That night, Emily called me. I thought, for a moment, that she might finally say something honest. Instead, she sounded tired and irritated. She told me Mom would have wanted us to keep the peace. She told me Karen had done so much for the wedding and didn't deserve to feel attacked. She told me, flat out, that my presence was becoming a problem. I asked her if she really believed that. She hesitated, just long enough to answer without lying outright. "I just need this to be easy," she said. After that, things escalated quickly. Invitations for extended family events stopped coming. My name disappeared from email chains. When I asked Dad about the rehearsal dinner incident being blown out of proportion, he said, "It's not about that one night. It's about trust." Trust. From the people who'd been quietly rewriting my role in the family for years. The breaking point came a week later, when I received an email from the wedding planner. It wasn't meant for me. I knew that immediately, but it had my name in the subject line. Robert's attendance, confirmation needed. The email outlined revised plans, revised seating, revised participation, and then, near the bottom, a line that made my stomach drop. Per family request, Robert will not be listed as immediate family in the program. Immediate family. I sat there staring at the screen, my hands shaking, realizing this wasn't just emotional sidelining anymore. This was erasure. A deliberate decision to redefine me out of the family narrative entirely. Before I could even process it, my phone rang. It was Dad. He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound apologetic. He sounded resolved. "We need to talk about something important," he said. "It's better you hear it from me." I asked him what it was. There was a pause, longer than usual. Then he said, "Karen and I have decided to make a few changes moving forward. About responsibilities and expectations." That's when I understood. Whatever he was about to say wasn't just about the wedding. It was about everything that came after. And as he started to explain, my chest tightened, because I knew I was about to hear the one thing that would finally make it impossible to pretend this was all a misunderstanding. I don't remember every word Dad said after that, but I remember how my body reacted before my brain caught up. My shoulders tensed. My jaw locked. That dull ringing started in my ears, the same one I used to get right before exams I knew I was going to fail. It's funny how the body recognizes danger faster than pride does. He talked about boundaries, about moving forward, about how Karen and Emily felt it would be healthier if expectations were adjusted so no one felt disappointed later. Then he finally said the part that landed like a dropped plate. They were revising the will. Not because I'd done something catastrophic, not because of some big betrayal, but because, in his words, the family structure has changed. Emily would be taking on more responsibility. Karen needed security. Things needed to be simplified. Simplified. That was the word he used to explain why my share of anything meaningful was being quietly reduced to almost nothing. I asked him, calmly, what that meant for me. He said it didn't mean I was being cut off, just rebalanced. He emphasized that word like it was generous, like I should be grateful for whatever scraps of connection were still being offered. I hung up after that. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just said, okay, because at that point, there was nothing left to defend. You can't defend your place in a family that's already decided you're optional. That night was bad. I won't dress it up. I sat on my couch in the dark long after midnight, scrolling through old photos I hadn't looked at in years. Birthdays, holidays, pictures of my mom, back when the family still felt like something solid. I realized how long I'd been trying to earn a version of belonging that no longer existed. The worst part wasn't the money or the wedding or even the humiliation. It was the clarity, the sudden, brutal understanding that if I disappeared tomorrow, the inconvenience would be minimal. They'd adjust. They'd explain it away. They'd move on. That thought sat heavy in my chest for days. I stopped reaching out. Not dramatically. I just didn't initiate. No texts. No calls. If someone messaged me, I replied politely and briefly. The silence stretched, and no one rushed to fill it. That told me everything I needed to know. Work started slipping. I missed a deadline. Then another. My manager pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay. I told him I was dealing with some family stuff. He nodded, understanding, and gave me a week to get back on track. That week passed in a blur of sleepless nights and half-finished meals. Rock bottom doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's realizing you've worn the same hoodie 3 days in a row because you can't be bothered to change. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon, of all times. I was sitting in my car during lunch, staring at my phone, when a message came through from an unfamiliar number. It was my aunt on my mom's side. We hadn't talked much since Dad remarried. I assumed she didn't want to get involved. Her message was simple. I heard what's been happening. Want to grab coffee? I almost didn't go. Old habits die hard, and part of me expected another lecture about keeping the peace. But something told me this was different. We met at a small cafe near my office. She hugged me tightly. No hesitation, no awkwardness. It felt grounding. She listened while I talked. Really listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't reframe my feelings into something more convenient. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "Your mother would be furious." That made me laugh for the first time in weeks. A real laugh. Because she was right. She told me things I didn't know. About how my mom had insisted, years ago, that anything they built together be protected equally for both kids. About how she'd worried, even back then, about what might happen if Dad remarried too quickly. About conversations I was never meant to hear, but probably should have. Then she said something that stuck with me. You've been waiting for them to treat you fairly. You don't need their permission to live well. It wasn't some grand motivational speech. Just a quiet statement of fact. And for some reason, that landed harder than anything else. After that, I started doing small things differently. Nothing dramatic. I cleaned my apartment properly. I went back to the gym, even though I felt awkward and out of shape. I stopped checking the family group chat, muted it entirely. I focused on work, stayed late a few evenings, caught up on what I'd missed. Opportunities have a strange way of showing up when you stop begging for approval. A project I'd been working on quietly for months suddenly gained traction. A senior manager noticed my work and pulled me into a meeting. He asked if I'd be interested in leading a small team on a new initiative. It wasn't flashy, but it was real responsibility. And for the first time in a long while, someone was trusting me without conditions. I poured myself into it, not to prove anything to my family, but because it felt good to be competent again, capable, necessary. Around that time, Emily sent me a message. Short, neutral. She asked if I was okay, said things were stressful, hoped there were no hard feelings. I stared at the text for a long time before replying. Then I wrote back, I'm focusing on my own stuff right now. Hope the wedding planning is going well. It was true, and it was the first boundary I'd ever set without apologizing for it. Weeks passed. The wedding got closer. I heard updates through distant relatives and social media. Dress fittings, bachelor party photos, smiling group shots where I was noticeably absent. It hurt, but not in the same raw way. The pain had shifted. It was quieter, more manageable. Then, one evening, Dad showed up at my apartment unannounced. I almost didn't open the door, but curiosity won. He looked older than I remembered, tired. He didn't come in right away, just stood there, awkward, like a guest who wasn't sure he was welcome. We talked about nothing for a few minutes. The weather, traffic, work. Then he finally said, Karen's been under a lot of stress. I waited. He told me the wedding budget had ballooned, that there were disagreements, that Emily was overwhelmed, that Karen felt unappreciated. The subtext was clear. Things weren't as perfect as they tried to make them look. Then he said, we might need your help with something. There it was. The shift. The subtle change in tone. The first time in months I was being addressed not as a problem, but as a resource. I didn't answer right away. I looked at him and realized something important. This was the first time he'd come to me without Karen prompting him. Without a script. He looked uncertain. I told him I'd think about it. After he left, I sat down and opened my laptop. Not to answer him, but to review some documents I'd quietly requested weeks earlier. Financial statements, old emails, things I'd never paid attention to before because I trusted that fairness was automatic. It wasn't. And as I started connecting dots, I realized my fall hadn't just stripped things away. It had given me clarity, information, leverage. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to how they treated me. I was preparing for what came next. And they had no idea. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. That was the strangest part. I hadn't uncovered some dramatic secret yet, nothing that would make a courtroom gasp or a movie audience lean forward. What I had was quieter than that. Paper trails, timelines, small inconsistencies that, when lined up properly, told a very different story than the one I'd been fed my entire adult life. I started slow, careful. I wasn't trying to get back at anyone yet. Honestly, at that point, I wasn't even sure what revenge would look like. I just knew I was done being confused. The first thing I did was request copies of documents I technically had every right to see. Old estate planning drafts. Emails from years ago where my mom and dad discussed finances. I framed it neutrally, professionally. No accusations. No emotion. Just organizing my records. Dad didn't question it. Karen didn't even know yet. That alone told me something. What I found wasn't explosive on its own. It was revealing. My mom had been meticulous. Everything she did financially had a paper trail. She'd insisted on certain protections, certain distributions, long before she got sick. She hadn't trusted verbal promises. She'd trusted ink. And then there was a gap. A noticeable one. A period after she passed, before Karen officially moved in, where changes were discussed but not finalized. Drafts rewritten. Clauses softened. Language shifted from firm to flexible. None of it illegal. None of it accidental either. Emily's name appeared more and more frequently. Mine less so. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't mention it to Dad. I just kept digging. At the same time, I quietly started rebuilding relationships I'd let wither. My aunt, a cousin who'd always been polite but distant. Even one of Dad's old friends who'd known my parents before everything changed. I didn't show up angry or wounded. I asked questions. Listened more than I spoke. People talk more than they realize when they think they're helping. One afternoon, my aunt invited me over for dinner. Just us. Halfway through, she casually mentioned something Karen had said years ago at a family gathering. About making sure things eventually go where they're most appreciated. At the time, everyone had laughed it off. In hindsight, it sounded less like a joke and more like a plan. I thanked her. I didn't react much, but I wrote it down when I got home. Meanwhile, Dad's request for help lingered in the background. He texted a few times. Always vague. Let me know. Things are hectic. We could really use your perspective. The more distant I stayed, the more his tone softened. Less authority, more appeal. Eventually, I agreed to meet him for coffee. We sat across from each other, cups cooling between us. He looked relieved just to have me there. He talked about logistics, about a vendor issue, about some payments that needed to be sorted. He hinted, carefully, that my organizational skills might be useful. I listened. I asked questions, neutral ones. And then, casually, I asked who was officially managing the wedding finances. He hesitated. Karen's been overseeing most of it, he said. With Emily, of course. Of course. I nodded, like that was expected. Then I mentioned, offhandedly, that I'd noticed some discrepancies when I was reviewing older family financial records for my own planning. I didn't accuse. I didn't specify. I just let the idea exist. Dad stiffened slightly. Not enough that someone else would notice. Enough that I did. From that moment on, I knew two things. First, there were things he wasn't fully aware of. Second, he didn't like the idea that I might be more informed than he assumed. After that, I stayed helpful. Strategically so. I helped draft an email to a vendor. I reviewed a timeline. I offered to coordinate something minor that took pressure off Karen. Each small contribution made me seem useful again. Harmless. Reintegrated. Karen noticed, eventually. She started including me in group messages again. Praised my initiative. Told Dad how nice it was that I was being supportive. I could practically hear the recalibration happening in her head. What she didn't realize was that I was observing everything. The way decisions were framed. The way credit flowed upward and blame flowed outward. The way Emily deferred to Karen more than she realized. The way Dad stayed just detached enough to claim ignorance later. I also noticed something else. Stress cracks. The wedding budget wasn't just ballooning. It was bleeding. Payments overlapping. Refunds delayed. Assumptions being made that money would work itself out. Karen was confident, but confidence isn't the same as control. One evening, while helping reconcile a list of expenses, I saw it. A payment that didn't align with the timeline. A deposit made earlier than expected from an account that wasn't supposed to be touched yet. It wasn't huge, but it was premature. I said nothing. Instead, I quietly asked my aunt to connect me with her financial advisor. Not to accuse, just to ask questions. Hypothetical ones. About trusts. About amendments. About what happens when intent and execution don't fully align. The answers were enlightening. Around this time, Emily reached out again. This time, her message was longer. She said she missed me. Said things had gotten complicated. Said she felt caught in the middle. I believed her. I also recognized the timing. I replied kindly. Carefully. I didn't reopen old wounds. I didn't apologize either. I was building something fragile. I wasn't about to knock it over by rushing. The real shift happened the day Karen asked me, directly, to help review some documents. She framed it as trust, as growth, as moving forward. She said she appreciated my calm presence lately. I smiled, took the folder, promised to look it over. That night, alone at my kitchen table, I compared those documents to the older drafts I already had. And there it was. Not a smoking gun. Not something dramatic enough to confront someone with immediately, but a clear divergence. A subtle change that favored one narrative over another. A choice that benefited some people and quietly erased protections for others. Me specifically. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. This wasn't about punishing anyone. Not really. It was about balance. About correcting something that had been nudged, little by little, until it no longer resembled fairness. I wasn't angry the way I'd been before. I was calm, focused, almost detached. I started making a list. Not of grievances. Of options. Scenarios. Outcomes. What would happen if I stayed silent? What would happen if I spoke up? What would happen if I waited? Timing mattered. The wedding was close. Emotions were high. Everyone was invested in appearances that made certain truths more powerful than they would be at any other moment. I didn't know yet exactly how it would unfold. I just knew this. They believed I was back in my old role. The quiet one. The accommodating one. The one who would smooth things over and step aside when asked. They were wrong. And as I closed my laptop and turned off the kitchen light, I realized I wasn't waiting to be included anymore. I was waiting for the moment when the truth would matter more than their version of the story. The morning of the wedding arrived with an odd stillness. Not calm, just quiet in the way a room gets right before something breaks. I woke up early, earlier than I had in months, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel that familiar weight in my chest. I felt steady. I'd already made my decision. The night before, I sent a single email. Polite, professional, addressed to the wedding planner, Dad, Karen, and copied to Emily. No accusations. No drama. Just a request to confirm a few discrepancies I'd noticed in the finalized documents, specifically the financial authorizations and the family designation language in the printed program. I attached supporting files, old drafts, time-stamped emails, notes from my mom that I'd never seen before but now understood fully. I ended the email with one sentence. I believe these need to be corrected before the ceremony to ensure everything reflects the original intent. I slept better that night than I had in years. By the time I arrived at the venue, my phone had already blown up. Missed calls, messages sent, then deleted, then sent again. I ignored all of them. I parked, straightened my jacket, and walked in like I belonged there, because I did. The venue was chaos. Not loud chaos, but the kind you recognize when smiles are forced and conversations keep getting interrupted. Staff whispered. The wedding planner looked pale. Emily was in a side room, sitting stiffly while someone touched up her makeup she didn't need fixed. Karen spotted me first. She walked toward me quickly, her usual composure cracked just enough to show panic underneath. "Robert," she said, low and urgent, "we need to talk. Right now." I nodded. "Calm. Sure." We stepped into a small conference room off the main hall. Dad was already there. Emily followed a moment later, confused and tense. Karen closed the door. Dad spoke first. "Why would you send that email?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry. It was shaken. "Because it was accurate," I said, "and because it needed to be addressed before things went any further." Karen jumped in immediately. She accused me of bad timing, of trying to sabotage Emily's big day, of misunderstanding documents I weren't trained to interpret. She said I was overreacting again, creating drama where there didn't need to be any. I let her finish. Then I slid the folder I'd brought across the table. "I didn't interpret anything," I said. "I compared it, line by line. These were Mom's terms. These were the revisions. And these," I tapped the last page, "are the changes made after you moved in. Changes Dad didn't fully understand at the time." Emily stared at the papers, her hands trembling slightly. "What is this?" she asked. "It's the reason I was suddenly a distraction," I said. "It's why I was quietly removed from programs and photos and conversations. It's why my presence became inconvenient." Karen laughed, sharp and brittle. "This is ridiculous. Your mother's gone. Things evolve. They don't evolve accidentally," I said. "They evolve because someone nudges them." Dad picked up the papers. His face changed as he read. Confusion first, then something closer to realization. He looked at Karen. "You told me this was consistent with what we discussed." Karen's voice softened instantly. "It was. I was protecting the family." "No," I said. "You were protecting control." Emily finally looked up. "You told me Robert didn't care," she said quietly, to Karen. "You said he didn't want to be involved." Karen hesitated, just for a second too long. The silence did the rest. The wedding planner knocked on the door, her expression tight. "We need to resolve the program issue," she said. "There are legal concerns. If this isn't corrected, we may need to delay the ceremony." Delay. The word Karen had been dreading. Dad set the papers down slowly. "Karen," he said, "did you change these without fully explaining them to me?" She tried to deflect, to reframe, to cry, but it didn't land the same way anymore. Not with documents on the table. Not with Emily watching her carefully for the first time in years. The fallout was swift. The ceremony was delayed by 45 minutes. Programs were reprinted, seating adjusted, the official language restored. I was listed as immediate family, not as a favor, as a correction. Karen didn't sit in the front row. She didn't make a speech either. The reception was quieter than expected. Polite, controlled. People sensed something had shifted, even if they didn't know exactly what. Karen stayed close to Dad, but not comfortably. Emily hugged me during dinner, longer than necessary, and whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Dad apologized later. Not perfectly, not eloquently, but honestly. He admitted he'd let peacekeeping turn into avoidance. He admitted he'd trusted the wrong voice because it was easier. Karen left early. In the weeks that followed, the changes continued. The will was revised again, this time with transparency. Boundaries were set. Not dramatically, but firmly. Karen lost influence she'd quietly accumulated. Family gatherings changed shape. Some people drifted. Others returned. As for me, I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I didn't cut anyone off. I just stopped shrinking. I kept my distance where it was healthy. I showed up where it mattered. I invested in the life I'd rebuilt during my fall. the one that didn't depend on approval or silence or being easy to manage. Revenge, I learned, doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's just standing still while the truth finally catches up. And the best part? I didn't have to leave quietly ever again.